Finally, hello everyone. Thank you for giving your time up on this Saturday afternoon when you could be eating a gelateria. We are instead going to be scaring you a little bit in a way when we're going to be talking about local news journalism and local community journalism and what needs to be done about it. So why does local news and community journalism still matter? Well, if you're a journalist, you may, like me, may have started off in local news journalism. I did it for 5 years. You still may be getting a living out of it if you're still involved in it. If you're not a journalist, you may care about what happens in your locale. You may care about kind of issues out there. You may want to hold politicians and bodies and institutions to account who perhaps are doing bad things. And of course, local stories as well can go national and international too. So, you know, they're a starting point for lots of stories out there. But what happens if there are no journalists to cover those local news stories, to cover those events? And I don't think it's too melodramatic for me to say that local journalism is experiencing an existential crisis. Newspapers are being closed. Journalists have been fired here in Italy, but also around Europe, US, and the world. So we're here to speak about what we can do, to look at, to boldly look at what's happening, but not feel sorry for ourselves, but also look at what great innovation is being done, and perhaps a way forward. So when I pitched this proposal, I was thinking of myself when I was a local journalist and I used to cover local council meetings. They were incredibly boring. And I think we agreed, I think 90% of the time you got absolutely nothing out of it. But sometimes, either through a mistake by a councillor kind of pushing through private minutes or a little nugget coming up, you'd be able to do a story. And that's just one concrete example. There's many more of what local journalists can do to hold people to account. The other thing that I've got with is, you know, we're accused, journalism accused of being hand in glove with PRs and, writing out press releases. But we are so terribly bad at PR in our own industry and explaining to people, you know, the role that we serve in democracy, to be frank. But how do we explain that to people without coming across as grand, as up ourselves, or even a little bit desperate? Also, what I want to speak about today are funding models. I think some people on this panel believe that local news journalism is a busted flush, is a busted model. So if that is the case, who do we turn to? Do the platforms, Facebook and Google, do they need to stump up more? Do we turn to the state for state aid? That holds its own problems if we're supposed to be holding politicians to account. Or do we look to VC funds where, of course, there's a high barrier to entry because newspapers aren't making money, but there's also philanthropy as well. So without further ado, let me go and introduce the panel here. They all hail from countries around Europe, France, Germany, Ireland, and the UK, but they've got experience of working in a vast array of countries, the US, Cambodia, knowledge of Australia and elsewhere. And that's what I'm hoping to achieve today, where we can get kind of insights from these countries. You'll see behind me there's a fantastic cartoon strip that's been done by Andrew Garthwaite, which kind of sums up, in a comic strip, the local council meeting. So that speaks for itself. So let me introduce the people on the panel. So to my immediate right is Alison Gall, the digital editor-in-chief of Trinity Mirror Regional. Next to her is Isabel Rugol, the international editor of LinkedIn. Hope I pronounced that right. Steffi Dobmeyer, who's the managing editor of Funker Media Group online. And right on the end, last but not least, Tom Fell, who's a senior lecturer at City University in London. And he's also head of digital there as well. So what we're going to do, the panel, I think the format is we're just going to launch into some questions and then open up to up to the floor, but if anyone's got a burning question to ask, just please stick their hand up. So because I'm the moderator, what I can do before anyone else is kind of knock down my own proposal, if you like, and say, well, the beat news reporter, it's an antiquated kind of concept. You know, you can live stream these so-called these meetings that journalists are supposed to attend, and we need to retrain them in other ways. So starting with you, Tom, what would you say to that?
You're wrong.
I'm being devil's advocate.
Drops mic. No, look, I think I'm going to take a step back first and talk about this perfect storm that locals have gone through in the last 10 years. Around about 2008, the world economy collapsed, and locals were hit worst. For a long time, circulation had been slowly dropping. It fell off a cliff towards the end of the last decade. Local newspapers in the last 10 years have lost probably something between 40 and 60% of their circulation, which was at a high in the mid-2000s. Classified ads have gone, but the market for local advertising has taken a big hit. Again, 30 to 40% of the advertising that would have gone into print is now gone to digital. At the same time, locals haven't been able to innovate as well as bigger nationals or international companies. The innovation hasn't been there, the skill set hasn't been there, and the transition to digital hasn't happened as well because in many ways they're too small, they've been ignored by the Googles and the Facebooks because they're not big enough. And all along as well, they've been cutting. They've been cutting because they've been trying to save, cutting back office, cutting back on editorial. And to a certain extent, they've shot themselves in the foot in that they've forgotten that what they do really well is local journalism. What they do really well is being the space where people can have conversations. It isn't all about accountability, although accountability is very important. Now and again, there's a dodgy councillor who should be outed by a local newspaper, and there are lots of examples across the world where that's happened. But a lot of the time, it's recording the first rough drafts of history. It's much simpler stories. It's the space where we can have conversations around: is the council spending enough on our schools, or should we build an extra park in that part of the city? It's not necessarily just accountability, it's actually that public space to have that public conversation. And that's where locals need to get back to. We'll talk more about business models, I'm sure, as the hour goes on, but my sort of fundamental point here is we've had 10 years of cuts, we've had 10 years of bad news. It's time to move forward now, and it's time to innovate.
Just one point to add on that. We have, I certainly speak with local councillors who, you know, a lot of them are there to perform a civic good and do that, and they actually say they prefer it when they have journalists kind of in the room because they act differently because they're being held accountable. Well, Alison, you're at the coalface, if you like, of local news journalism at Trinity Mirror Regional Group, which is the biggest regional group in the UK. How would you respond to what Tom said there?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I've been in local news since I was 18, and it's quite a long time. I joined my local weekly newspaper straight from school, and I've worked for all the major UK news groups. Most recently Trinity Mirror for the last 15 years. So I feel like I have a fairly good knowledge of how mainstream local media works in the UK. I will say that nowhere I've worked, for as long as I've worked in local journalism, has there ever been any money in the newsrooms. I've always arrived just after the good times. The boardroom dinners, the have some money for winning an award, that's never happened. So, you know, I am used to operating in a resource-light environment, as perhaps it might say in a government minute. What I would also say about a resource-light environment is that it makes you agile. It utterly makes you agile. We have to... It's not about doing more with less. We do less, inevitably, and we do different with less. So I would counter that we are extremely innovative to the point that things that we were doing in our newsrooms in 2008 were subsequently adopted by The Guardian as kind of their digital practices. And one of the things that we have to do is promote skill sets, because we have smaller teams, much smaller teams, so people need to be able to do the job that they can do to the best of their abilities. And we do collaborate with platforms. You know, Facebook works with us regularly, Google, and myself, actually, at Trinity Mirror, we run digital news roadshows for training of all journalists, so that might be hyperlocal or student or mainstream. But I'm not going to sit here and like kind of say so everything's amazing, because everything is far from amazing. We are in a crisis right now of how we are going to fund mainstream media, and part of that is actually, I think, the public deciding whether they want mainstream media, whether they understand what we do. I think that, I think it was your point, we are pretty wretched at telling people what we do and how we've done it. So that's probably a key part. We have got ourselves into this difficulty.
How can we do that better then? How can we kind of explain to people our function without sounding too grand? And I'm expecting another no to this answer, and this one's for you. But I mean, the elephant in the room is, do people not care about local news as much as they did, or at least the way it's presented to them?
Well, I think Tom was mentioning earlier, sort of going back to the fundamentals of what local journalism is about, which is about community. It just baffles me that local news would be the thing that people care least about, when it's the thing that is closest to their lived experience. And if there's one journalist that people can actually like, which I know is a hard thing for a lot of people at the moment, it's certainly, the guy who drops off his kid at the same school that you do. I mean, local journalists are fundamentally, that middle class sort of average Joe that people can definitely relate to. And are bringing you a sense of place, a sense of community. I think that's one thing that we're really lacking when we lose local journalism. I have kind of a pattern of just choosing a new country and city to live in every couple of years, and the first thing that I look for is local news, because I want to understand where is it that I'm moving to, how do I meet people here, how do I participate in local life. When I moved to London, I couldn't find that. And I'm voting for the first time in the UK in council elections next month in the borough of Islington, and I have no idea what's going on besides the leaflets from politicians. So I think, if we want to do a PR job for journalism, local is probably exactly where we should be starting, because it's your school board, it's your council tax, it's things that are extremely concrete. And as someone, who works in a tech company with a lot of non-media people, I have learned that when I get into a conversation about, editorial independence and our core role in democracy, I see eyes just roll over, because, aren't we so grand? What makes us so special and different from other professionals in other industries who also are doing important things? And but when you make it very concrete to what it is that you're actually bringing people, then they get interested. So, we can talk between ourselves about, democracy with a big D, but I think we just got to get down to brass tacks for people outside the industry.
Thank you. Steffi, why don't you tell us about the outlook in Germany, and specifically where you work, where at your place there's actually centralized newsrooms, which you would think would hurt local journalism, is actually, you believe, is using to help it?
Well, the thing is that the media company I work for owns 12 newspapers and 15 websites. They're all regional and local, different sizes. And we have decided to build a centralized newsroom almost 3 years ago. And it's a centralized newsroom where we do all the national and international reporting for all those papers and local websites, in order to give them the space to just concentrate on the local and regional stuff, which has two sides. On the one side, we give them that space so they don't have to care about all the national, international reporting and news. And we have combined more or less all the former small Berlin offices into a huge centralized newsroom of 70 people that can do much more when it comes to national and international reporting than a small Berlin office could have before. So it's like we hope, a win-win situation.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you, Isabel, about your experiences at your first job, which is while you were a J school kind of student, and which was a really novel way in the US of how local newspapers work.
Yeah, sure. So I was a student at the Missouri School of Journalism, which has something called the Missouri Method, which is actually like 100 years old, and I really would argue that every journalism school should adopt this model because it's great for training and it's great for the local community. Are you a Mizzou grad as well? Yay!
It's the oldest journalism school in the States.
It's the oldest journalism school in the States. I don't know about the world. I was lucky to be in the Centennial class in 2008. So the Missouri Method is essentially the model of, think of a teaching hospital applied to journalism. So the school owns a local paper, the Columbia Missourian, which is where I learned the trade, as well as a NBC affiliate TV station, an NPR affiliate radio station. And students, as part of the curriculum, are the working staff of those newsrooms, with editors who are professionals as well as teachers in a journalism school. And so instead of learning the theory of being a reporter, you're actually going out to city council, going out to school boards, talking to the community, and writing and putting out a daily paper every day.
And so who is funding that?
So it is funded by, it is a paper that we sell, and we sell advertising, and it is actually also a lab for business models and for innovation in journalism. So really important not to operate outside the real world. It is obviously also part of the university. So there's an endowment, which if anyone is interested, is trying to grow at the moment and will happily take donations. It has, and it has funding from the university as much as it can, given that the Missouri legislature has kind of given up on higher education. But that's another debate. And so it's that's how it operates.
But you were sent, so as a local kind of journalism student, you were sent down to New Orleans to cover the 1 year on from Hurricane Katrina, which no local journalism kind of student would ever really do elsewhere. So it's a fascinating model. Yeah,
that was a fantastic opportunity. I was covering the religion beat, which I think how many local newspapers even still have a religion beat, but I was covering, the Hindu community and the Catholics and the mosque and everyone. And the local Presbyterian church was sending a bunch of volunteers down to New Orleans to clean up a year after, and asked me if I wanted to come with. Pitched it to my editor, Tom Warhover, great teacher, who said, sure, you go ahead. We actually partnered with the local NBC station. So it was a TV journalist, a photographer, and myself, went down to New Orleans for a week and covered the reconstruction, or complete lack thereof at the time, of New Orleans a year after Katrina.
And you've also kept an eye on kind of what's happening in I see you on LinkedIn writing about it quite often, and there was one image that you flagged up from the Denver Post, which if you can kind of flash that up here, you can explain this image.
Sure. So the state of local journalism in the US is quite similar to what Tom was saying. I graduated in 2008 in a double whammy of the financial crisis and the demise of newspapers. So the roles that me and my generation of journalists would have typically taken and learned the craft in kind of disappeared from under our feet. And I've actually spoken to a lot of journalists in my graduating class or around who feel a bit uncomfortable in our professional situations because, we've made do, we've made all right, but we fundamentally feel like we're lacking these 2 years of experiences of just on-the-ground reporting. And this illustrates it perfectly. The Denver Post very bravely last week dedicated their editorial pages to taking on their own owner, Alden Global Capital, which is a hedge fund. And this is a photo. The original photo was of the newsroom team 5 years ago after they won a Pulitzer Prize. And they have blacked out everyone who has been pushed out, forced out, left since, which is just a pretty visual representation. And I actually interned at the Santa Cruz Sentinel back in 2007, which is owned by the same hedge fund. So you had kind of the demise of you know, advertising and the financial crisis and everything that just really took down a lot of local newsrooms. And then on top of that, you know, the original owners of the paper were struggling, and a lot of them just sort of capitulated and sold it on to hedge funds, which do what hedge funds do, right, which is get the money and get out.
So let's talk about the funding model. Thank you for that. Then, so you know, I think it used to be more homogenous, didn't it? You know, back in the kind of the pre-digital days, Tom, where you know you had your classifieds, you had your ads, and then you know the platforms kind of came in. What are your views on Google and Facebook, who've hoovered up a lot of the funding that journalism have, and they've basically taken away their model? What's your view?
Sure. So if you look at kind of the last 20, 25 years of local newspapers, you know, they've by and large, up until about the late 2000s, there was a huge amount of consolidation in the market in the UK and Ireland. And thinking of Johnson Press, probably the best example, spent €250 million in Ireland buying up local newspapers. They ended up selling for 8 million a couple of years ago. So they took a 95% hit on their investment. The reason they did that, though, was because local newspapers were licensed to print money in many cases. They had huge audiences. They were licenses to print money in their local markets because everybody wanted to advertise in the local newspaper. They were very well read, and great circulation.
Particularly in Ireland as well.
Particularly in the UK and Ireland and in Australia, very similar markets. So these were very profitable companies. They were bought up, and then suddenly, as we know, the financial crisis happened and so on. But I suppose to get on to the tech companies and that, locals weren't smart enough or quick enough to respond in many cases. Now, there were notable exceptions, but the vast majority of them weren't able to respond to that shift. So you had a shift in consumer demand as well. So younger people just weren't buying newspapers, full stop. I stopped buying newspapers a couple of years ago. I still subscribe to loads of them. I mean, I'm probably spending 50 or 60 euros a week on subscriptions.
Why is that?
But I only buy a Sunday paper now.
But what, I think a lot of people, it's a time thing.
It's simply how I live my life. My consumption is the time it takes me to get to work in the morning. That's where I consume media most. The rest of the day, it's maybe jumping in and out. So I'm a very good example of why newspaper print editions don't sell as much as they used to.
Okay.
Now I still buy niche products. I still buy a local, and I still pay for a Sunday newspaper because I have time to read both of those. I like to have a croissant, as you might have noticed. I like croissants, you know, on a Sunday and read a newspaper. It's a different product.
You're looking fine to me. I can't see any crumbs.
It's a different product. But the daily newspaper, or you know, the print edition has transitioned, and there's something wrong with that.
But I think we'd agree with that. But what do Facebook and Google need to do then?
Sure. So. An awful lot of the digital revenue, something like 85% of the revenue that's transferred from local print has gone to the big tech companies, Google and Facebook. And I'm just going to be honest, they haven't done enough to support locals. Legally, are they required to? Of course they're not. But morally, I think there's a real question mark around whether or not it's morally acceptable for these big tech companies to hoover up all this digital advertising and not give anything back.
So Google have given some back, and
Google
I think
certainly
you've
have,
been
and
a benefit
I'm a
the
recipient
largest.
of that myself.
Yeah.
I'm a recipient of that.
But they could. You think they could do a lot more?
When it comes to locals, specifically, as a specific market, they haven't done much. We've seen small things. We've seen small things at local level. Facebook are doing a little bit now around trying to build community pages and work with local newspapers. The Google D&I fund, some of that money has trickled down to local. The BBC have given 8 million as part of their license fee to locals, but it's nowhere nearly enough. And we need to see a lot more. I think the locals need to bang the table more, make more noise, and say, hang on a second, we're not going away, we're staying around, we give a great product, and we deserve to be funded.
So essentially, sorry, if you want to.
Oh, can I offer a response to that? I think it would be. I mean, it's grand if you know, Google and whoever decides to put money on the table. I don't think that as an industry we should wait for sort of other companies to decide to do the right thing. I think, as you pointed out, you know, what we were selling originally wasn't news, right? We were selling advertising, and news was the way to get people to even look at the advertising. So the news product itself, you know, was it ever a money maker? No, because the news, I mean, news is a product that is, there are few industries like that, you know, you can think about health and education that are just, it's not like selling biscuits, right? It's a whole other thing. And it's, you know, we talk about the newspaper as a public trust. And so what are alternative models, if it's no longer advertising supported, that could support that journalism, maybe without a profit. I like the model of the Voice of San Diego in the US, which is so local Southern California news, and they have a membership model as well as a few grants. Yeah. So it's kind of a non-profit model, and maybe I would love for it to be self-sustaining businesses, but maybe there isn't room for that in a lot of local
Well, that's what we were talking about earlier, about this homogenous model kind of being smashed, and you're seeing lots of kind of local, lots of different business models kind of emerge. I'll try and defend Facebook because they haven't sent anyone here, I think, this week, and be the devil's advocate and just say, well, we blew it, you know. And I think you acknowledged that, Tom, didn't you? That so perhaps we're not providing the right content for our readers if we're not subscribing to them, and they've come in and kind of, that's capitalism, isn't it? I mean, I guess.
It is, but that's not good enough, though, either. You know, just because it's capitalism doesn't mean it's right. I think there's a you know, given all we know now about Facebook's business model, and I don't want to just pick on Facebook, but I am going to. You know, their chief executive has just spent a couple of days this week in front of the U.S. Senate, having to explain what happened with the intrusions into privacy. You know, the monopoly rules exist for a reason. There's, you know, these are enormously big companies that have near monopoly positions in the advertising market.
So they should pony up and pay.
They should pony up. Absolutely, they should. But I do agree with Isabel. It's not the only model. There are lots of other ones. Yep. Philanthropy.
Yeah, well, let's talk about philanthropy, because this is this talk is actually born out of a speech I gave to the European Journalism Centre Impact Summit in Manchester. And some people hear from that. Adam, I can see, who's done a lot of work thinking about philanthropy and how it can fund journalism as a whole. I think there's an issue in that it's more prevalent in the States, I think, although I think, you know, I've spoken to people in the US, and compared to arts and other endowment funds, it's very small. I mean, this gets into the PR thing as well, where, you know, Adam's, you know, through his forum, he may want to say something on this later. He's getting funders, VC people, and perhaps philanthropists to come and meet kind of journalists, and I think that's where we need to kind of explain what, you know, what we're doing, and that's where we do the bit of PR. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Look, there's lots of different models around. I really like the Missouri method. I hadn't come across it before, but there's absolutely no reason why in some cities universities couldn't take a role and be the non-profits. We're already seeing that a little bit with Goldsmiths and with Cardiff, and where I work at City, and with Galway and with Limerick in Ireland, where the journalism schools are working with local newspapers, not to the same extent.
Not to that extent,
but
no.
But there's certainly something in that. There's room for profit. There's nothing wrong with, it's not a dirty word. There's room for for companies. I think they have to do more consolidation, but there's room for the profits. There are examples like Bristol Cable where you've got really interesting and innovative hyperlocals that are doing really interesting things. There are the non-journalist journalism happening on Facebook and happening on different kind of community forums. There are all kinds of problems with those as well.
Yeah. Which we'll go into in a bit. Yeah. But can I ask one other funding, because I'm quite keen that we get through all the issues. So government funding is another thing, and it's almost as if Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, kind of read this kind of this proposal for this panel, because she suggested that local journalism needs government kind of state funding as well. You know, Steffi, let me ask you, how would you feel about journalism being funded by the state?
Well, actually, in Germany, just the public, there are some TV stations that are funded by the state, but when it comes to papers, this is just not something.
It's not a fly.
It's not something that I would feel comfortable with, and it's, of course, they're always, we're talking about that from time to time, but they're not real models for that. And we had this huge discussion after our election in last September, when the right-wing party AfD joined parliament, and this party really attacks journalists all the time. And one of the critiques is, or the critical points is that we're all like, that the government actually is guiding the news. So just in case we had some governmental funding for newspapers, we would have a crazy discussion in Germany. Yeah. So I think this is not going to happen.
Alison, would you say if Theresa May decided through this consultation that locals and regionals needed state funding, and that it was done at an arm's length level, I'm being the devil's advocate again, done at an arm's length thing, done through a kind of a semi-state board where it was kept away from you, how would Trinity Mirror feel about accepting funding from the government?
Well, I can't speak for Trinity Mirror as like the board, but I will say that for probably 70 years, local journalism was state-funded because there was nowhere else a council could advertise its jobs or its public notices or, well, anything. You know, the Western Mail, the national newspaper of Wales, which now sells, what, 20,000 copies a day? 13,000, thanks, Emma. You know, that on a Thursday, every house in Wales had that copy of the newspaper because it had not only regional news in, but it had probably 13 pages of jobs, the majority of which would be council. So I think we had that tap, and it got turned off very suddenly, and we are, you know, in the state we are now, possibly because we placed an over-reliance on sanctioned funding that we actually had no control over.
Okay, thank you. Let's just move on from funding for a second. There may be questions from the floor later on. I anticipate a few. Let's talk about, actually, it was something that Tom said that struck me about, well, he doesn't kind of read a local newspaper. So have we failed our communities in a way in the kind of the stories that we're interested in? So Alison, again, you were speaking yesterday, and there was a couple of things which struck for me. I think you said we need to learn humbleness, and we need to get away, you know, from that notion that we're the font of all knowledge. Newspapers, you know, need to read us. And I think Jennifer Brandel from Harkin said, you know, we need, you know, our communities need to tell newsrooms, you know, what to write about rather than the other way around. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think newspapers did retreat, and I use the word newspapers quite deliberately. We did retreat quite a lot. Now, I was a local patch reporter for a geography, and I had, if I made a mistake, the person I'd written about would be looking at me over the front counter telling me exactly where I'd gone wrong and what they thought of me. And it kind of not only keeps you kind of very focused as a journalist, but it really reminds you that you are writing for people. When you stop having that daily contact with your audience in the real world, they become the audience, not, you know, Phil at the fruit shop, or, you know, with Tom, the local councillor, or like Barbara, who is your front desk receptionist, because you don't have a front desk receptionist anymore. So I think when we move towards online and we are becoming more digital, and we're trying to reconnect not just with kind of audiences, but people who aren't our audiences in any way, having a conversation and learning more about need states for people in the areas that we cover, the geographies and the topics and the cultures, that's just a key bridge builder. And I always think if you can find an audience and it is committed to something, then you will find ways to fund your journalism.
Yeah, I agree, and I think really it's pretty, again, going back to the basics of newspapers as the agora, as the core of your community. I dream of a newsroom that is like a completely open space where people can watch the budget, the editorial meetings. You know, I don't know, maybe there's a business model in having a newsroom that also is, you know, a cafe and a meeting place and events, and it just can't be. And of course, a lot of newspapers now, you know, they've sold their buildings downtown and they're way out because it's cheaper. But the further away you are from your community, the less people are going to care when you disappear. You just got to be in their face. I remember the first newspaper internship that I did when I was like 13 years old at a local paper in my little hometown in France, and it was a building, it was smack down in the middle of the city, and I would, you know, see it on my way to school and I would look up and be like, wow, I want to be there one day, you know. That is what a local paper has to be. There are several, sorry, I'm going to plug the Missourian again, but they have for a few years, she just left, Joy Meyer, who's doing a lot of work around engagement journalism and having a readers board who participates in telling you like what the paper needs to do more. One thing I hate is when I've seen this in newsroom and it drives me crazy. You know, a reader calls up the newsroom and a journalist refuses to take the calls. Like, I'm too busy. You're never too busy for your readers.
Or go write a letter.
Yeah.
And also, newsrooms need to reflect their communities better as well. That's something that you've spoken about as well, as Alison.
The diversity aspect, yeah. We just need to be a more broad church in kind of the people who are working in our newsrooms, and not even in our newsrooms actually, just across our businesses, because you know we have a fairly straightforward approach now of you come out of a journalism school, so you'll have a degree. You'll have had the money to be able to afford to have a degree. You know, you will be, you'll probably be interviewed by somebody who has a degree, who is white, who has a certain, whether they know it or not, unconscious bias around elements of who they want in their newsroom or the type of person they want in their newsroom. So we need to expand the people who are coming into our newsrooms. We really need to be more reflective of our communities, and until we do that, we're not going to make a massive difference.
I just have a question. When you say we have to talk, you said that you have to talk more to the readers. I know that in the US you usually put the email address below the article that you've written, especially in the papers. Are you doing that as well? I mean, is this something that is, because I know our media systems are kind of different, and I don't think that a lot of German papers are doing that, and this would be the easiest way to get back to the person who wrote something and just to ask.
Certainly, I would say probably most local and regional newsrooms would do that. The onus is then on somebody to get in touch, isn't it, though? There's that barrier to entry whereby you have to make the effort to want to connect to the journalist who may or may not respond, and then do it again. So I think it's a start, but it's not a complete option, that one.
On a panel yesterday, I heard from De Correspondent, a Dutch site, who a woman working there mentioned that as part of your job description as a journalist there, I think about 40 to 50% of your time has to be on engaging with the community. Yeah. So it's about also how we define our jobs. Yeah. We no longer live, you know, and I guess it's my bias coming from a social platform, but we no longer live in a world where a journalist can afford to just broadcast whatever they have to say, and it only goes one way, right?
Yeah, the thing is that I wouldn't say that in Germany we're not talking to the audience, but I think it's a different. I don't know. I have done a fellowship in the U.S. and I've worked for the Oregonian in Portland, Oregon, for a while. And the first piece that I wrote for the paper, they put my email address and also the telephone number below the text, and I just didn't know that. And then suddenly people started calling, or I went for a break and I got back and I had this like blinking voicemail, and I was completely, I didn't realize that this is something that I could expect. So they were like, okay, they're readers and they want to talk to you, and I was like, okay, they want to talk to me, why? So I was not used to that.
But how amazing is it that people actually
yeah, that was really
no,
it was really crazy. And the thing is that all the messages were really positive. It's not that I would assume that a lot of people, because in Germany, if you get letters from readers, usually it's not nice.
But that was the way that people, that was their forum, wasn't it? We call them the Green Ink Brigade, where disgusted from Tunbridge Wells would write in a letter and complain. And I think that has changed. I think we can all agree that we're listening to people a bit more. I guess let's move on to kind of if we're perhaps not buying newspapers anymore. There's lots of innovative kind of new news outlets that are kind of starting up. So certainly in the UK, there's the Bristol Cable, which is like a cooperative where you kind of vote effectively for kind of what story that you want to cover. There's Cardiff University. Emma's doing great work there as well, which I'm sure she'll be happy to speak about at some point. The Bureau Local as well. And, there's this rise of hyper-locals that have come perhaps to replace staid local newspapers. But do you think, is this scalable, Tom? That this can work in certain areas, but is this something that can work on a bigger scale?
There's a real mistrust among what I would call traditional media of the hyperlocals and of the community media, and I'm the first to admit that there are all kinds of problems with them. But actually, they're doing a really good job in some cases, and we can't dismiss them and say, oh, they're all just libeling everybody and we should forget about them, because it's not the case. And in the rush to save money in the last 10 years, where newsroom budgets were cut across the UK and Ireland and other countries, they stepped into a very important space, and they became the voice for the voiceless, and they became the place where you could have these conversations about, why is no one talking about the cuts to the local school? Or I've just been talking to the district nurse who said, she can't go and see my mother because funding from the NHS has been cut for what she does. Or I'm trying to make an appointment for the doctor, and it's for 6 weeks' time, but I'm sick today. That actually happened to me, by the way. 6 weeks appointment for a doctor. So these are the kind of things that, in that rush to save money and in those kinds of cuts, that's what got lost, and they stepped into the breach. Look, some of them work well, and some of them don't, and some of them might be scalable, and some of them aren't. What I think will happen is you'll have, and this is where I think Facebook could do more, and I'm saying this in a positive way, and I know that Facebook are thinking about this and talking about this.
Oh, they can do more. I was just defending them because no one else is here.
But this isn't necessarily going to cost a lot of money. This is actually quite an inexpensive thing to do, is to help media companies, local media companies, actually re-establish links and re-establish trust, and get back into those communities and get into those community pages. And in some cases it'll be hyper-locals that are not-for-profit. Yeah. In some cases it'll be the armchair auditors who just haven't got an outlet. And I think there's lots of room there for innovation with local media. And certainly the Bristol Cable is a very good example, but there are others around the place as well.
Well, we have someone here. Would you like to take it away, Emma, on what you do?
So I'm Emma Mees. I'm from the Centre for Community Journalism at Cardiff University. And, oh, sorry, that way. Okay, sorry. So we've been working in this sector for the last 6 years, working with community and hyperlocal news journalists. just to help support and nurture this sector, because we saw that there was this new emerging sector of small independent publishers. Local newspapers are closing down or retreating completely, or just withdrawing their services from communities, and we were finding that we had these small independent publishers stepping in, but actually nobody was supporting them. And you might have somebody 2 villages apart doing exactly the same thing, and they didn't know of each other because of the nature of the work they did. So for the last 6 years, we've been providing a network, a space where they can get together, where they can talk, where they can learn from each other. And we've got to a place now where we recently launched in January the Independent Community News Network, which is ICNN. And it's a representative body, a formal representative body for independent community and hyperlocal news publishers in the UK. And since January, we've got 75 members. And the work they do is absolutely fantastic. So our members all adhere to the Editor's Code of Practice. We've got the leading media lawyer in the UK. He's on a retainer, so they get access to legal support. So the quality and standard of the work they do is really high. So what we really need to do is to get them on a level playing field. So like you were saying about getting access to statutory notices, local newspapers do still access it, not to the same extent as they did before, but they have access to that. And now you've got other people who very often have got, you know, equal, if not greater, readership and loyal readers in their community, and actually they're not getting access to any of those funding. So we're working with the NUJ at the moment in the UK to try and get access to press cards. Because when legislation was drawn up to how you access a press card, it was taken as a given that you work for a local newspaper or you work in journalism. There was no such thing as setting up your own news website. There was no such thing as being an owner publisher. And that is the case now. But actually the legislation around things like access to statutory notices, money, access to press cards, they haven't caught up with the times. So we still have a lot of work to do to get our sector on a level playing field. And then we can start looking at what we do as a whole, but at the moment it's not really a level game. And with the work they do, I think gone are the days of saying they're just bloggers or just, you know, those days have kind of gone. Obviously you still get some, and you will get some people who set up Facebook pages and they're not journalists, but actually the work we do as a centre is we're there to help with the training resources and support as well, to try and limit those mistakes made by those people that aren't trained. But actually we've got so many people in our sector who are qualified journalists who've lost their jobs in mainstream media. They feel so passionate about journalism, they've gone and set up their own community or hyperlocal publication.
How is this funded?
There's a whole raft of different business models. Actually, I've got a presentation on it which I can put. I'm going to do a Corinne now. Corinne's brilliant at doing this and saying I'll put it on Twitter. There's all sorts of things. So you've got social enterprises, you've got limited companies, you've got sole traders, you've got people who subsidise their work with other things, you've got cooperatives. So Rachel Howells, who sits next to me, set up a cooperative called the Talbot Magnet. So the Talbot Guardian newspaper closed and withdrew completely from the area, and there's about 30,000 people in the town, and overnight they lost all access to news and information. So 7 journalists in the area had lost their jobs through mainstream media, and they got together and formed a cooperative and set up a hyperlocal in its place. So maybe Rachel would like to talk about that. But and then you've got the membership models. There isn't a one size fits all. It's a real experimental, but there's this massive rise in entrepreneurial journalism, and we've heard a lot of things about entrepreneurs. It's a real rise in it, and
but making it sustainable is the big thing, and
it is.
And looking at scale as well is the big question, because I think that's Tom's point, is that they're great, but how do we make them work and sustainable and stand on their own feet?
Sometimes it comes down to the individuals, and sometimes some people are more business minded than others.
Like good local newspapers, there's some better ones than others. Yeah,
absolutely. And we're finding a lot are going back into print, because when you work on a very local level, local businesses, your local shop, your local hairdresser understands we've got 6,000 people in the village, you're going to print 10,000 copies, one will go through every door and the rest will go in the doctor's surgery, will go in the hairdressers. They understand that, and they say, yeah, I will buy an ad space. They still don't understand the value of eyeballs on a screen, so that digital revenue stream, they still don't get it on that kind of really local, hyperlocal level. So we're finding a lot of people are going back into print, and the print model is working really well for a number of people. And I think when local newspapers close down, again, there's a campaign been with the National Union of Journalists that, certainly in the UK, that if a big media organisation looks to close a newspaper, then that should have the opportunity to become a public asset, that people in the area should have the opportunity to take that publication on. And we found from speaking to all the people who have gone into print in our sector and our members, that it's not that print isn't profitable, it's just not profitable enough when you've got shareholders' pockets to line as well. So if you don't want to cream off at least 20% profit off the top of it, then actually if you're a 1 or 2 man band and you're happy just to fund yourselves and feed yourself, then actually it's perfectly doable and perfectly profitable. So again, it's just kind of looking at different ways of doing things.
That's a really good point, actually, John, that print isn't dead. I think we should say that louder. We've been talking about it for 10 years, that, you know, the doomsday scenario. I think 2026 is when print's supposed to stop in the UK and Ireland. But actually, print's doing fine. It's not doing as well as it used to do, but it's holding its own. And there are different things, like what you just talked about there, where really, really small scale print actually can do really well in a small town. One thing I just wanted to mention, though, I think it is important to say, is that, and that's really great, everything you've just talked about, but there is a Wild West as well in the community media. For every good website doing, or a good Facebook page doing good work, there are lots of examples of bad ones. The trials have collapsed in the UK and Ireland because of coverage on social media. People have been hounded out of their homes by lynch mobs because of being incorrectly labelled as paedophiles because of social media. There are really well-meaning but really, really dangerous community websites that have set up all over the place.
I would say those are more things like the Facebook spotted pages, where you get a member of the community who says what's going on, and then their leadership, they're not hyperlocal, they're not community media.
Well, we can.
I would definitely 1,000,000% argue with you that it's not a case of for everyone there's another one and there's a Wild West. I absolutely hate things like the Facebook spotted pages where they're anonymous and you've got one person and you can send anything in and it's all anonymised and they say anything and they're libelous and they're slanderous. And that's why it's important that we do have things like good quality hyperlocals and newspapers to counteract that. The one good thing about the spotted pages, it shows that there are communities in towns and villages right across the UK, Europe and the world that are still really interested in what's happening in their community. So it shows there's an interest in news. So people saying, I just passed an ambulance next to the high street, anybody know what's happened? The problem is you don't have a journalist in those pages and they go, oh, actually, I saw a dog next to it, and then it was a motorbike, and then there were 3 cats, and then it was an alien, and then there was a helicopter, and then it's all speculation and slander, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah. It's all happening in Cardiff, isn't it? Sorry.
So those kinds of things, they show there's still a want and a need and an appetite for news and information and what's happening in your community. But that's why there's always going to be a role for journalists, because those journalists will always need to be there to verify and clarify. So I do accept that there are pages out there, but I do object to saying that they are hyperlocal and community pages. They're different things.
Well, I mean, we can disagree about the title, but the unfortunate thing is that they do exist. And I absolutely do agree with you, though, is it does prove the need for local media. We absolutely need well-trained journalists to work in local communities and to give people verified information, to hold people to account, to be the space for the conversations, be it online or be it in print. We really, really need to protect local journalism.
Thank you. Steffi,
I would like to comment on the print is dead thing, so if anybody has a question to other things, I don't want to interrupt.
No, Steffi, please say it, and then I think we are definitely going to open it to the floor.
So the thing is, I'm working in digital news because I'm leading the digital newsroom of the centralized unit, and I wouldn't say that print is dead, but I wouldn't say that it's flourishing either. So in Germany, print is not doing pretty well. That's why we always try to find a way to work together with online much more stronger than we did before. So I have the feeling that we're talking a lot about newspapers, and I was wondering whether this means we're just talking about the print version, or whether we're also talking about like the newspaper that is distributed in either paper or online or whatever.
The
so
news outlet, yeah. But I think a lot of the revenue is still coming through the
that's
newspaper, right? Which that is the problem. I've got loads more questions. Sorry, go on.
Just to second what you say, I think it's super important to think. I personally think of newspapers as the institution, as the newsroom, and I use the word newspapers because traditionally it is in newspapers that original reporting has happened, and a lot of other media kind of reuses that work. But then whether it's in print or in digital is kind of pointless. I haven't read a print newspaper in years. And
Okay, there are people on the floor itching to say their voice. So I've got loads more questions, but please go for it. And please introduce yourself as well.
Broken it, oh no. Hello, my name's Rebecca. I work for a local newspaper in the UK in Hampshire. It's a really small town, so for NewsQuest, so I'm sure you know of NewsQuest. So many of the issues that you've spoken about, I experience. For example, I'm technically an apprentice, and for the last 2 months, it's been me and one other reporter covering our whole town for a weekly newspaper every week. But what really got me was the talk of the print is dead and the online mediums like the spotted pages. And what I find, which is really frustrating, is that young people in my town, and I'm sure across towns in the UK and other places, they don't really care about their local newspapers. They get any local news they want from Facebook. They're not interested in reading. They don't want to take the time to do it. So what I would really love to know is, do you think there's a way that we could actually encourage younger people? Not, you know, I'm a journalist, so I'm an exception. I love reading anyway. But local people that wouldn't necessarily read the newspaper, to actually encourage them to see the value in this, because I find it so frustrating. They don't seem to realise there is value for young people in local newspapers.
And most of them just don't see the difference between the news in the paper or online or on Facebook, and there is a difference. You just have to, yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Only that we have been chasing the young people audience for, oh my goodness, since like Lord Beaverbrook first thought, I'm going to open a title somewhere in the arse end of nowhere. So yeah, the youth audience, or like the kind of the early 20s, etc., it was always kind of established that you didn't care about your local newspaper or the press locally until you kind of bought a house and had a kid, and suddenly they were going to school and it was really relevant to your life. And I think that's probably the key. What is in their life that we are not relevant to? What do they care about that we should be reporting on? And then not only how do we reach them, which is probably not through print, but, you know, fish with a fisher, but how do we present that story? Because frankly, you know, if I were 20, I would probably prefer to look at a cartoon by Andrew that told me the news in a 4 screens than read a 350-word piece on my mobile phone that was going to eat my data, which was capped. So I guess I don't have solutions around it. I just have thoughts about it, and it probably begins and ends with like knowing who you're trying to write for, and then start to ask them why they should care about what we're doing.
And the thing to I think figure out is it an age thing, which is fine because we all get older, sadly, or is it a generational thing, which is more worrisome because then these people are never going to become your subscribers. I couldn't care less about local news when I was 19 or 20, and the older I get, the more I'm actually interested in seeking it out. So hopefully that's the answer, and the world is getting older, so that's good news for everyone.
They have no idea when they read a story on Facebook where it comes from. You know, the research shows us they just don't know where that story's originated from, and if they were to say where's that come from, it wouldn't be from like the Andover paper. It would be, oh, I got it from Facebook. You Andover. I used to live near there.
Oh, I know Andover as well, weirdly. One point that you made, more diverse newsrooms, younger newsrooms, will know stories that, you know, their cohorts are interested in as well, so it goes back to that point.
Me and another colleague who's my age, we're both women, we're both 24 years old, and it's just us two, just doing the whole paper, so. It's kind of encouraging, kind of.
I would love to read that right now.
Oh,
I wanna
yeah, bravo. I want to see that paper.
Tweet it out, please. We've got more questions coming.
I wanted your thoughts a little bit on the Bureau Local model. So Bureau Local and ProPublica has a new local reporting network. CIR is about to start the same thing. So the idea is that nationally they do the heavy data lifting, and then they push it out to the local newsrooms who can do very locally focused, data-driven stories on which political candidate is better for my kid's educational future and healthcare. So also sort of in the back of your mind that maybe you won't elect Trump and you won't vote for Brexit if locally you know how those issues will impact you. And I'm wondering, because I've been doing this for years in places like Pakistan and Kenya, sort of central data analysis and pushing it out. But in those environments, it's weird because the internet hasn't actually disrupted the traditional media model yet. So they can do sort of digitally driven reporting without really having competition from a national media. So it works really well because people listen to the radio and they watch their local TV station and they really like this local content. So I wonder what you think. Do you think projects like Bureau Local will enrich the content, local level content, the investigative content to a level where people will see the value and that can kind of overcome the competition from national media or Facebook? Or is it just sort of delaying the inevitable death?
Maeve McClenaghan was speaking from the Bureau Local earlier today. Unfortunately, she can't be here, but anyone from the panel want to take that one?
Yeah, sure, because I found a lot of what you said in the work that we're doing, because we have the centralized newsroom, and one of our newspapers, is based in Berlin actually, they have a huge data section, and it's actually one of the best data sections that we have in Germany. So when they're doing data-driven projects, they do it from their Berlin perspective, but they offer all the data from all the other towns and all the other regions for our centralized newsroom in order to just give it to all our 12 papers that are located in all kinds of different regions in Germany. So we can use the data that are done by this team and just transfer it to where it's needed. And it works pretty well. And the thing is that the small newspapers in the small towns, they don't have a data team. So it's pretty important for us that we can provide them with the data that is done within an expert team and given to the smaller units, like the smaller papers who could not afford to do that. And they love that because they don't have it once a week. So for us, it's working pretty well.
So briefly, because I know Corinne's got a question that I need to get to, but we've had a central data unit in Trinity Mirror for about 6 or 7 years now, and I think it's 14 people strong. They clean data sets for the whole country and send out 1 or 2 bulletins of that a day to all our newsrooms so they can look down a big list, see what the data set, for example, on hospital waiting times for A&E is in their area, and then they can see where they sit against the rest of the country. They also make that. They also make gadgets and interactives that work. So, and those sit on GitHub, so they're publicly available. But the kind of point I'm getting to on that is, I know the Bureau Local will work because our data unit works brilliantly for us. We're looking forward to doing work with them actually, and I think it's a great resource. They've got some great reporters working for them now on the investigative side of things, and it's only going to enrich the journalism that we can do in the UK.
Actually, I think there's a lot more room for those kinds of innovations. We're seeing them within groups, so you know, the NewsQuest, the Trinity Mirrors, the Johnson Presses, and so on have centralised a lot of the back office functions already. They can deploy advertising centrally. They can do a lot of the kind of features and the gardening and the motoring supplements. Those kind of things can be done centrally. There are very few subs left locally now. Most of that's done centrally. News pages tend to be just templated and templates are filled in. So editorially, the data is the first area where we've seen this kind of thing. But there are lots of places, I think, where a lot more of that could happen. There are difficulties, of course, when it comes to for-profit companies versus journalism being an altruistic or a true good. The Bureau Local is funded by the D&I fund to produce this stuff. What Trinity Mirror is doing is obviously for their own group, which is absolutely fine. But I think there's a lot more room for a lot more innovations along the same lines of what you're talking about. I think it's absolutely only can work, and we need to see more of it.
Adam Thomas from the European Journalism Centre is doing a lot of good as well with local journalism, and I'm afraid I'm going to embarrass him here. He's done a huge amount as well to kind of get this debate going. Corinne, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, well, I wanted to mention something about, sorry, I'm a radio journalist and that makes me nervous. So move away from the speaker and get closer to the other one. So, excellent. I'm sure you can sort that out. So, no, that's fine. So, on media literacy amongst young people, I wanted to give you just an example, and then I wanted to throw a question to Isabel and you. I'm sorry, having a moment. So on media literacy, there was a newspaper that was set up in Australia for children, and it was called Crinkling News. And I think something to keep in mind is that it was immensely popular with kids. It just didn't have a good business model to fund it, so it went under. But it established the principle, and they ran a big forum in Sydney, #MediaMe, which was about media literacy. It established the principle that young people, kids, are interested in the news, as long as it's written for them. But we still come back to the business model issue, right? And that is, I guess, leading me to my observation and question, which is, you come to events like this and you see people go to a session and they go, oh, I came across a really interesting business model today. You think, well, okay, how is it as an industry we know so little about how the money's made, right? I mean, I run a consultancy and I've managed businesses before, and it's my job to know, down to the paperclip, what it's worth, right? So I find it horrifying that we don't know where the money is coming from, and also that we rely on advertising staff to know where the money is coming from. And they can, you know, if they lose their jobs, they can sell real estate or biscuits or whatever they want to sell. We're selling democracy, okay? So it's kind of important. Yeah. And so it's a question to the educators on the panel, because LinkedIn owns Lynda, right? Yeah. So we don't know how to make our money. We don't understand business models. So how can educators help us know, so that we don't have to wait for once a year to come and find out about a cool business model, and that's like a surprise?
Well, yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. That, and I think that's changing a little bit. I think because of all the hurt that's been happening, journalists have kind of opened their eyes a little. By the way, a newspaper, just like what you described for children, is exactly what got me in the profession. I was 7 years old, and my parents subscribed me to that, and it was brilliant. So for me, it's been eye-opening joining a tech company 6 years ago from working in newspapers. Because I got a really quick education in the corporate world and how everything works. I will insist that our editorial is completely independent from our commercial interests, but I understand our business model. I understand what we do for the business and why what we do is an important part of a business. And that is fundamental, and I know that in my training I was, you know, taught maybe a little too much to, there were media outlets at one point where the advertising people couldn't even take the same lift as the journalists, you know, and it's insane to think that, oh, I'll just write what I want to write, and I'll just, democracy and whatever, and the rest of them can take care of selling it. It's completely divorced from the real world. So I'm gonna pimp Mizzou again, but I recently hosted a class from the university who came to visit me at LinkedIn. Brilliant young people who spent an hour and a half grilling me with very thorough questions including about our business model and all that. And they were part of their professor teaches a capstone publishing class, when at the end of the semester they have to pitch a whole business model for a publication. They have to build it from scratch, and that really needs to be a core part of our education as journalists. Though it doesn't happen just in early education, because as Alison pointed out earlier, we really need to get better about having people in the industry who do not go through the journalism school system, who do not go through college. So it needs to be something that is ongoing and a part of a culture shift, I think, in the industry.
I'm sorry, I'm being waved up. We've got time for one more question. Adam, go for it. If somebody can pass the mic on to him quick, and we'll try and answer it as quickly as we can.
Sorry, I don't want to do the mansplaining thing, but I actually just wanted to reiterate how amazing the women on this panel have been so far. Like Emma, Alison, Steffi, and Isabel. How do we produce more leaders like you four?
Oh, that's delightful. I can't.
Well,
well, as not a woman on the panel,
Tom.
Let me just say that the statistics are showing that about 70% of applicants to journalism schools are female these days. Yeah. I had a conversation with a very senior editor.
No, I'm really sorry. I really want to hear from the women on the panel. I'm really sorry, but I think it's super important. What has there been a turning point in your careers as you've developed that have turned all four of you into these amazing leaders? Because it's inspirational.
So, in Trinity Mirror, I know that we have a whole layer of really brilliant, talented executive editors who are women. They will gradually move up, but it's a waiting game. And the thing is that what we need to make sure is that we have people coming through who will be the next layer of brilliant executive women who can then move up. It's a recruitment thing. We need a 1+1 minimum requirement when we're recruiting. We need far more, I think, promoting newsrooms as places that are, good spaces to work. If you're female, you get respect. You have, support for your family and life goals as well as your career goals. And you need mentoring from people who will, male or female, who will listen to you and come up with, I think, useful things that are tailored for you, not a here is the grievance policy, here is the sexual harassment policy, actually things that are useful. And we should probably talk a lot more to girls in schools about what we do.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole other panel and it's on its own, and there have actually been a few that I've heard have been good. Journalism school, as Tom mentioned, are packed with women. And then my first job, I looked up and it was all men. And I really had a moment where I was like, what the hell happened? Where did all the good women go? And I think, it's what personally was helped me. My bosses have always been men. They've been brilliant men. My current boss has been an incredible promoter and supporter of my own professional growth. That matters a lot. So, the guy's doing the right thing. And peer mentorship has been incredibly important for me. At LinkedIn, there are a lot of brilliant women that have taught me so much. I've been hiring a lot of women myself, and I try to contribute to their own growth, and hopefully, we'll do better. We'll keep doing better year after year.
Well, I can give a +1 to everything you said, so I'm just going to add something. When I started my career, the first deputy editor-in-chief, she was a woman. She told me in my first talk to her that me as a woman, I will always have to give 200% instead of 100% like my male colleagues. And I hope that at some point we don't have to say that anymore, because I don't want female journalists to just live up to their male colleagues, but just be women in journalism. So I just hope that this will change, and if I can be a part of that, that's pretty amazing.
Because it's a bit exhausting to 100% all the time, isn't it? Yeah.
So I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up there. Just a couple of stats that actually Tom gave me before this talk. This applies to the UK and Ireland, but I'm sure it applies to all around the world. The median decline in circulation UK and Ireland between 2007 and 2017 was 50%. Some 20% of the titles that were existing in 2007 have gone. Advertising revenue in some areas is down by as much as 66%. So I'm sorry, as you go back out into the sunshine, you get some kind of cold, hard facts. But there is an important point to be made. It's down to us, the people in this room, and the people in this industry to try and fix it. I'm afraid no one else is going to help us, really, because, you know, journalists, not many people feel sorry for them, so it's down to us to fix it. And what I would love to see, and I know there are people in this newsroom who are trying to fix it and care about it, I would love to come next year or the year after and be sitting there and hearing some fantastic plans in place for how we fix local journalism. So please, can you show your appreciation to this excellent panel? Thank you.